see everybody this morning, and so many fresh faces, new faces here. It's fantastic. One of the things that overarches everything we talk about is human rights. And when we're discussing any element of corporate responsibility, human rights is something that we all have to embrace as a way of life. So regardless of which sort of section we're dealing with, and what I'm going to talk about this morning, please consider that the human rights of everybody that we're working with and the supply chains, whether we're in our own business, is a fundamental requirement that we should all be embracing. And anybody who hasn't actually looked at the UNGP, United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights, should do so and consider what those key aspects are. Because this is about what we're embracing as a business that next to taking on board. And I have to say that from the top of our business, our culture is one that is led right from Simon Wolfson all the way through our management, that we actually embrace human rights and workers' rights through everything that we do. It doesn't mean that we don't get challenged, because we do at times, but one of the key principles is actually believing in what we're doing. We do it because it's the right thing to do, not because somebody's telling us what to do. So, question. Why is fast fashion considered not to be ethical? Anybody on the floor? No, not you, Adil. You're not.
Short production runs.
Short production runs, right? Anybody else? Why is it considered not to be ethical? Price driven? Okay, is that the reason we do fast fashion? Is it price? No.
Yeah. I think the pressure, the excessive pressure it puts workers under to deliver to targets.
Right.
That's why.
Okay.
Yeah.
But why is fast fashion important to us?
Stay on trend.
Yeah, on trend, replenishment, yeah? I don't actually believe that fast fashion is an issue as far as compliance or ethical trading is concerned, because it is a different set of responsibilities that we have to embrace. It isn't about the actual model itself being incorrect. We all want a level playing field. We want a level playing field for everybody. Our suppliers want a level playing field. They want to be able to compete on what it is that they're good at, whether it be product, whether it be price, whether it be quality, or whether it be delivery. One thing that we do seek as a business is to ensure that if we have a level playing field, that we can actually measure our suppliers against their performance correctly. However, the reality isn't that way, because we have an unlevel playing field, because we have the bad guys and we have the good guys, and what is very difficult for the good guys who are looking to achieve a level playing field is to actually play by the same rules. Because what is happening is within our supply chains there are things going on that are unbalanced and unequal. Traditionally, a business measures its supply chain performance or its supplier's performance by three key measures. The metrics: the quality of the product, the speed to market, and I'm not saying most importantly, but in many businesses, most importantly, is the margin that's achieved. And when you're talking to buyers and merchants, you'll tend to understand that those three metrics are the key principles that they are measured on themselves, and therefore they measure the suppliers on it as well. So, fast fashion. Well, fast fashion normally means that it has to be closer to the UK. So the only thing that really means something significant is the actual reduction in transportation times. In other words, it's those couple of 3 weeks that it takes to make a product closer to the market here in the UK, saved by the shipping or transportation costs. Because I know, and having come from manufacturing, that factories around the world are equally as skilled as anywhere closer, or Turkey, or in Europe, or Eastern Europe, at making product quickly and fast. Lead times in factories do not vary very much. It is about planning, and it is about the transportation costs. But what are those things that we've got against us? Well, the reality is that where we come closer to the UK and through Europe and Turkey, etc., You've got higher labour costs. You've got smaller factories. And many of them lack skill management and certainly lack corporate responsibility resource. These factories can be exploited by unscrupulous agents and suppliers. And within these marketplaces, there is systemic subcontracting and even subcontracting. That is the way they work. You'll find factories and assets in the countries that we call fast fashion actually do not own an awful lot of assets. There is a high opportunity for conspiratorial, devious, defective behaviour by suppliers and their factories on the basis that they see those three metrics as the three critical things that they have to embrace to provide the service that we as brands are looking for. And where are their marketplace? Where do they get the labour from? Well, there's a huge opportunity for exploitation of workers. It could be refugees, it could be migrants, it's vulnerable people, it could be children. And then what do? Well, a lot of people out there say, well, what happened to me? Well, believe you me, it does happen to us because, you know, we had a factory in Yorkshire where we had slaves working, building our mattresses. And it was on the BBC, and believe you me, when I talk about devious, criminal and conspiratorial behaviour, attending court and hearing what happened and how those people were treated and the lengths that they went to disguise them, actually shows to what extent people would invest to deceive corporate responsibility management and monitoring. Most brands adopt a tick box approach. Third-party auditing does not deliver value in any shape or form. All it does is give us an opportunity to say, we think we know what's going on. Well, an unskilled person going around the factory asking set questions without any understanding even of sometimes what the question is that they're asking for, or even understanding what the symptoms that they're looking for within the factory, to my mind is valueless. There are brands that do not invest in corporate responsibility or believe in what they're actually doing as far as corporate responsibility is concerned. And there's a lack of appetite to have full visibility of the supply chain. Everybody focus on tier 1. What is going on in the tier 2s or the tier 3s in factories? How many organisations actually bother to go and audit embroiderers, laundries, tanneries, mills, finishing products? What about the UK? What about the product that's brought in wholesale and is refinished and repackaged? Those are the areas where we see the biggest threats and the greatest risks. There has to be an alternative, and there has to be a way of working that can bring our suppliers into our environment. We have to understand that the success of a supplier and the success of our own business are intrinsically linked. You have to ensure that there's the opportunity for commercial success within your supply chain. But we have to also ensure that we are taking our responsibility, the custody of our suppliers to ensure... 1 minute, oh God. Right. So, basically we have to create a partnership because there are 4 metrics that we have to deal with. It's the quality of the product, it is the speed to the market, it's the delivered retail margin, but it was also the compliance of our factories. There are 4 metrics. And the way to do this is to bring this into the attention of the business and to make sure that when you're measuring suppliers' performance, it is about bringing in that 4th element of the ethical performance of those factories and your supply base yourself. We spend a great deal of time working with our buyers, with our merchandisers, with our supply chain and sourcing teams to make them understand. We work proactively because we truly understand that true partnership is transparency and trust, is sharing of each other's problems, is intuitively respecting the rules that we have all agreed. You expect everybody to follow what it is that we've set out to do, to be honest. constant communication with your supply chain is the key to make them understand what it is that you are truly trying to achieve. And then to give reward for the achievement of all of those elements and the partnership that you actually develop. So we truly see the value of partnership as being where a customer and supplier develops a close and a long-term relationship, but the two are working together, and the aim is the best possible commercial advantage that can be achieved by that relationship. Because teamwork is better than combat. So many times we see CR as the police force going in and trying to measure what is wrong. Surely what we're doing and what we believe in investing in the 46 people that I have in my team, they spend very little time auditing. What they do is spend time managing and going in and working with suppliers on problems. Our auditing is our metric on ourselves of our own business to be able to understand how well we are performing. So from Next point of view, we make no distinction between fast fashion and standard procurement. Thank you.
Fantastic. Really helpful setting the scene. And this is, just to say before we move to our other speakers, this is really, we asked Chris to talk about obviously how his business is managing this issue, but this is really, the purpose of this conversation is to talk about the industry writ large. So it's not about whether Next is alone doing the right things, but indeed hearing from them about what they're doing, I think it shapes this conversation. Jenny?
Yeah. Okay, thanks Cindy. Good morning everybody. Probably a lot of you have never heard of a global union and what it is. So we've been around for over 100 years and we represent national industrial unions. So garment worker unions around the world affiliate to us. Like for example in the UK you have Unite, you have TNG, they are our members. They affiliate to us because we don't just cover garment workers. So that's our authority here, is we represent the garment workers in the countries where the clothes are being produced. So I want to come first to the question, can fast fashion ever be ethical? My immediate answer to that is yes, of course it can, because otherwise why would we even be here? The question of is it ethical at the moment is no. But I would make the same comment that Chris made, that it's not really about fast fashion. Because even before the rise of fast fashion that we see today, there were abuses in the garment industry. Historically, it's been a place where women, children have been exploited. We've all heard of sweatshops and we know the history of that. So what does fast fashion bring? Fast fashion brings more pressure. It brings higher volumes and it brings more speed. So what that does is it puts more pressure on an already failing system. But if you have the right number of workers to produce what is needed in the time provided, there's no need to have abuses. But the situation we have at the moment is that doesn't exist. So the pressures are there. The other pressures Chris has also mentioned is the pressure to keep down costs and to maximise profits. So if you do nothing, the system is one that is prone to abuses, as Chris explained right at the beginning. The question is, what can be done to stop those abuses? So I started looking at, well, what are the actors that can do something about this? And your first port of call would be governments. We look to the government to enforce the rule of law. If you have good standards, we expect those standards to be enforced. And in most countries, there are standards which may not be perfect, but they do set certain levels of wages, which are low, and working hours. But what we see is that those standards are not enforced. And even in the United Kingdom, again, as Chris said, abuses happen. Even the power of the UK government to enforce standards is limited. And when you look to some of the countries where garments are being produced, you see not only governments that don't have the capacity to enforce their own standards, they don't have the resources to enforce their own standards, and a lot of time they don't have the will to enforce their own standards, because these are countries that are competing for foreign direct investment. And unfortunately, one of the narratives around the garment industry is for governments to compete to offer better conditions to multinational companies that want to source from their country. They'll offer all sorts of tax concessions, but they'll also offer freedom from trade unions, low wages, and freedom of regulation. And that is one of the difficulties that we are dealing with, is the government's not playing their proper role in terms of enforcing the rights of their citizens. So that's the first port of call for enforcing standards. Another port of call you would go to for enforcing the standards is the brands themselves. And Chris has explained some of the struggles and the difficulties that Next has, in common with many other brands, in trying to use their leverage over their own suppliers to achieve those standards. Firstly, you've got a bit of a dual role, because while Chris is trying to, work with the suppliers to improve standards, he's got his buyers trying to work with the suppliers to get the cheapest price and get the best product and get the most timely deliveries. And within some companies, that is a real tension, because many companies have not done any work to bring those two arms together, and they're working completely independently, or some of them don't even bother with the ethical part of it. They just focus on the buying. So you've got that difficulty. You've also got what is the influence of a brand? If Next is sourcing from a factory and is trying to work with that factory, what other brands are also sourcing from that same factory? Do they have the same will for changes? Are they going to send the same message to that supplier? What actual leverage do you have? And even if you have 100% sourcing from one factory, say, I'm using Next as an example because Chris is sitting here, but you understand that, I mean, anybody really. If Next was sourcing 100% from one factory, you'd think, okay, Next can set the rules for that factory. But if that factory is working in an environment of many other garment factories, there are severe limitations for how far out of the norm that factory can step. It can't suddenly start doubling workers' wages. It can't suddenly start, having completely different conditions from the other factories around it. It'll get pressure from its other factory owners in the same area. It'll get pressure from the government. It's very, very difficult. So there's a real limit on what an individual brand can do. And Chris has already mentioned the limitations of auditing. And what the message that we try to give to companies is, we know there are problems. You don't have to keep checking to see if there are problems. Let's accept there are problems. What are you going to do about it? We want you to see you putting your effort into solving the problems that we all know exist. The days of naming and shaming, I mean, it's still necessary when brands are doing nothing. But brands that are trying to do something, there's very little value in saying, we've got you, we found this, we found that. We know it exists. The question is, what are you doing about it? So that's the second limited area of pressure to make changes. But the third one is even more limited at the moment, and that is workers themselves. The garment industry has very few unionised workers. And what does a trade union do? A trade union gives the workers the capacity to enforce standards inside their own factories. It gives them the power to come together as a collective instead of working individually, and it gives them the support that membership of a trade union can give. And what we're recognising is that this is a major obstacle to achieving proper enforcement of rights. Rather than Chris flying in from the other side of the world to fix the problem in a factory, if you've got a trade union on site, the idea is that that problem can be fixed more locally. It's entirely possible. But you see it here in the UK, you also see it in the US. The public image of trade unions and the rhetoric is very, very hostile to worker organisation. And that translates also into the garment industry, but you're getting very direct and specific pressure also from factory owners. In many countries, it is almost impossible to join a trade union, and the amount of courage that it takes to try to do that when you know as soon as you mention the word in a factory, you risk getting sacked or worse, and people are still today unfortunately being killed for trying to organise a trade union. You've got massive obstacles. And one of the problems that we face is people talk a lot about freedom of association, because that is the right. It's a human right. Everybody has the right to freely associate, to join a trade union. But unfortunately, the environment that many workers find themselves in is that it is so hostile to trade union organisation that saying you have the freedom to do something is not enough. What we need is much more proactive work to say trade unions are part of the solution. They are what will empower workers to be able to deal with the abuses locally, to build standards, to have negotiations, to increase wages, etc., etc. I have to rush through the rest. What are we doing? Oh, 2 minutes. I thought it was one. Okay. So what are we doing as a trade union? One thing that we're doing is we're entering into global agreements with garment brands. We have a global agreement with H&M. We have a global agreement with Inditex, which is the brand Zara. We have a global agreement with Mizuno, and we're about to sign a global agreement with Chibo. Don't have many of these yet because it's quite new for the garment industry, though the Inditex agreement is quite long-standing. And what that permits us to do is to work directly with those companies to work with the local unions in each country to build them, to get them engaging directly with factory management, breaking down some of those cultural barriers to having proper union management dialogue in the factories. It's going to have limited effect because of what I said about the capacity of individual brands to act. So one of the other things that we're doing is we're trying to work much more at an industry basis, and we're doing this with the garment brands themselves. And one of the main reasons we've been able to do this is because of the Bangladesh Accord. I think you perhaps know about the Bangladesh Accord. It came in the aftermath of Rana Plaza. It is a binding agreement between global unions and garment brands and retailers. We didn't know how many would sign originally. We now have over 220 global brands and retailers that are part of the accord. And we're seeing that if you work at that truly industry-wide basis and you have a common objective to change standards across an industry, you can actually do it. It's a big challenge. I'm not sort of saying that it's easy to work on fire and building safety in Bangladesh, but we've made more progress than was ever possible before. So what that's given us the confidence to do is to look at how else we can work on an industry-wide basis. And the initiative that Cindy referred to, which we call ACT, is about brands and industrial working together to try to address the root causes of low wages in the garment industry. And one of those root causes is there is no mechanism to actually lift up the wages. There's minimum wages that are set by the government, but I already mentioned the pressures that governments are under to keep wages low. What we need is collective bargaining at the level of the industry. So ACT has two main objectives. One is to institute industry-wide collective bargaining agreements in garment-producing countries that enable the workers themselves to negotiate an appropriate wage, which then applies across the entire industry and provides the level playing field that Chris was talking about, but to link that process to the brand's own purchasing practices so that they must be able to pay the wages that are set through the industry bargaining. There's a lot more to explain about that, which I'm happy to do, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and congratulations to Jane again for the best ETI question. I should say that as academics we're trained not to ask questions that we can't answer. But I'll speak about something akin to this question, and I think what interests me is really to ask about the conditions under which fast fashion is produced, or the conditions that lead to unethical production processes within fast fashion. And I agree with Chris and Jenny that there's nothing intrinsically in fast fashion that is unethical. It's really the context that it is set within that produces the kind of outcomes and abuses that we see in some places. And I mean, Jenny and Chris are much more widely traveled than I am in this respect. I'm really focusing on sourcing hubs in high-wage economies. So we've done a study under the leadership of ETI, with ETI stakeholders on the largest sourcing hub in the UK, the East Midlands and Leicester. There are similar patterns, similar dynamics going on, for example, in Prato in northern Italy, where there's a large Chinese workforce that caters to the Italian fashion industry. We've heard of garment clusters in the US, in New York, LA, where there's again similar patterns, and the aspect of near sourcing is quite important, and that's the driving force of that. So we've, obviously heard that the proximity to consumer markets is important. There's the whole equation about price, speed to market, quality, etc. And in theory, that can outweigh prices, except obviously where we have structures that allow various actors really to sidestep regulations. Whether that's that's really all actors in the chain really that do that. So that really was the reason. That's a picture that Chris used as well. The report we did for ETI was called a new industry on a skewed playing field. So that skewed playing field really is an important metaphor to characterize what's going on in many places at the moment. The other aspect that I think is really important is the aspect of a new industry. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that, because I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the actors that we see are completely different from, let's say, the way they used to be even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I can go on into detailed questions a bit later on if you want to. Feel free to ask questions. But if we look at the key actors in the value chain, so on the one hand we have elite firms that not only have grown, it's not just about size, but they're also very different kinds of actors. So we got actors that are brands, we got actors that are supermarkets. A lot of supermarkets have their own fashion lines nowadays. We have a lot of discounters that have entered the market, and I think the internet has been important in that dynamic of shortening the production cycles. We have online-only brands as well that operate with different quantities, different business models, obviously. At the same time, if we look at the other end, the manufacturers are shrinking. So if we just take a sort of simple statistical average of the average size of a garment factory, of a manufacturer in the East Midlands, it's 10 employees. Obviously that's an average. That's not necessarily the outfits that companies like Next are sourcing from, but it's important because if there are lots of very small actors that are competing all the time for orders, for probably very small orders, that has an impact on the market. And last not least, we still have trade unions that look after the garment sector in the UK, but they find it very difficult to gain access to workplaces, and in terms of social dialogue or collective bargaining, I think these are really institutions that have more or less come into disuse. So if we shift our focus a little bit from those actors in the value chain, what about the government? Regulations to do with labour markets, with product markets, how competition is regulated. Now starting with the labour markets, it's obviously important to see how the supply of labour is regulated. In the worst case, think about modern slavery, but in a sense more to do with sort of, it's the wrong word I guess, mainstream issues. There has been a lot of talk about the national minimum wage, the living wage now. It's a couple of years back now that an academic from the LSE, David Metcalf, has tried to calculate, has looked at HMRC, who are responsible for enforcing the minimum wage, has calculated how often an average company would be visited by a minimum wage enforcement officer, and the calculation that he got to at the time was once every 320 years, which is obviously not very effective enforcement, one would think. In the same way, if we look at health and safety, there's been studies academics have done on health and safety executive, and basically class it as unfit for purpose. If we look at a kind of a different category, if you like, of support or institutions, what has been very important, what we've seen has been very important in the past in our study, is funding for English courses as English as foreign language. That has been kind of provided through community organizations, because the workforce is, well, a lot of the workforce has actually British citizenship, but obviously a lot of them have immigrant background, South Asian background in most cases, and in a sense, seeing the conditions under which they work, the question, well, why don't you try to get out of the sector and work somewhere else, was a very, very logical one, and we've always asked that question. And the answer was always because we do not speak English well enough to go anywhere else and get another job. So in a way, that's also a way of building, developing, maintaining a captive workforce.